Really thrilled to have you all join us. There's been a lot of interest in today's speaker series, and I'm excited about it. I'm Joe Spencer. I'm the president of the St. Paul Downtown Alliance, and I'm thrilled to see so many of our community leaders and board members for the Downtown Alliance and folks joining us. Again, the topic has been a hot one lately, one filled with lots of speculation, and I saw this presentation through an organization we're a part of called the International Downtown Association, and was really impressed with it and thought you all would like it. I actually just wanted to start as a kind of preview for the conversation ahead, just to share some of what we're doing at the St. Paul Downtown Alliance, thinking about the year ahead, thinking about our recovery as we're eager to welcome back our workers and visitors into downtown St. Paul. We normally have 55,000 workers in downtown St. Paul, and like everybody, many of you today working from home, we're down to a fraction of that right now, and we know that us being successful in providing a positive experience as people are coming back for the first time in a year and a half, sometime in the months ahead, is critically important to the future of downtown. And so we're working hard at that. We're planning a series of activities that I think are going to really support that. One is we're working with the city, but we're also trying to raise some resources that we can supplement what we're calling a safe and clean heavy up. Just to supplement, add some resources in so that as your workers, as you're coming back to downtown, we've got some additional resources in the downtown that'll add that extra presence and make you feel like you're coming back to a clean place and a place that feels safe and secure. We know that's basic table stakes. But secondly, people love downtowns because they're fun, exciting places to be. And so we're going to try to supplement the marketplace with activations and activities, music, fun, trivia in the parks, out in our public spaces, so that as you walk out and about, you're seeing a vibrant downtown that you missed. And so we want to make sure that that's there for you. We're gonna try to put that in place. And then the third piece is I think it's really important that we all do a good job of communicating about it. Probably everybody on this call loves downtown St. Paul, has a passion for it. And so we're going to try to put some communication tools in place and some resources out there so that we can tell the world about all these great moments and corners and favorite bits about downtown. So we're looking forward to that. I wanted to introduce Jim Scannell, who's actually chairing our Employer Recovery Committee. Jim, if you just go ahead and say a few words, I'd appreciate it.
Sure, thanks, Joe. So for those of you who don't know me, my name's Jim Scannell, and I work with travelers, and amongst my responsibilities are global real estate. Also, when it comes to this pandemic, or really any kind of crisis we deal with, in this case, I kind of co-lead a lot of our company's response to this. And so, as Joe and the board and we talked about everybody coming back, we really talked about the need to kind of unite across the employers so we really have a good feel for when are people actually going to come back. I can tell you that the rumor mill of our employees, or the rumor mill in any given state, is always amazing how it kind of goes wherever it goes. And we wanted to make sure that we're tied and we can kind of say for sure what each of us are planning to do and when, so that we're all cognizant of that, of when other people are potentially going to be coming downtown. And we can also have the ties into the city, into various, really all of the entities that are involved in making downtown vibrant and successful, so that if there are problems that pop up, that we can quickly get them addressed and make this return back downtown as pleasurable experience for everybody. And we're, as I said, we're going through this kind of across the country, in Europe and other places, and every single state's different and every jurisdiction's different. And so, I think that what Joe's put together here is really going to help. And as time goes on, I would encourage you all to kind of give feedback if you see things that you're not hearing about. And that's the beauty of this is let Joe know. Joe and Emma are here to get you the answers and make us all successful. So thanks in advance.
Thanks, Jim. So please don't hesitate to reach out, and with that, I think we'll launch into today's presentation. So again, I mentioned I saw these two. I give a presentation with the International Downtown Association. I thought they were fantastic. So I'll introduce Chris Weinberger. Chris is the managing partner and co-founder of Places Platform, which assesses place-based economic, social equity, and public health by measuring and managing economic growth, net fiscal impact, real estate valuation, achieving social equity, and increasing public health. And David Smith, we were talking earlier, just before we got started here, has I think one of the coolest titles I've ever encountered. He's the global head of occupier insights for Cushman Wakefield, and I think both bring a tremendous experience and wonderful insights to this conversation. And I'm deeply grateful that you're willing to share your time with us in downtown St. Paul this afternoon. So Chris and David, take it away.
Thank you so much, Joe. Really appreciate that. Great introduction. So Chris and I have had the pleasure and opportunity to work together on this particular project for the last 6 or 8 months now, really looking at what is the future of the office. And so between Cushman and Wakefield and him and Michael Rodriguez, also over at George Washington University, we were able to dive in, starting with the question of why the office in the first place. And so we'd like to start there because it helps us understand, what role has the office played historically, and what might that mean for what the role it plays in the future, which could be similar, but certainly could be different, and likely will be. And then we're going through this grand experiment, not by anyone's design, but where we've had a lot of people working remotely, a lot of organizations that might be, 50, 60, 80, even 100% remote for some portion of the last year. And so we wanted to dive into and understand what has been working in that environment and what hasn't been working, because that helps inform, in the future when we're in a more hybrid, more agile workforce, what should be done where. And then, a couple of other things that we wanted to talk about is sort of what organizations and downtowns and cities need to be thinking about and what should be considered as we move to a more agile workforce. Like that's sort of the base understanding right now is more people will be working remotely in 2022 than were in 2019 on any given day. So how do you make that work? What's the change management involved in that? What's the technology required to do that? And what does the future of the office and the total workplace ecosystem, if you will, which includes the office, includes people's homes now, also includes third places like coffee shops, co-working and flexible office. How does that all work together? So let me see if I can, there we go. Let's start with the 4 purposes of the office that we really dissected. And this really comes from kind of a historical review that Chris did, both offices, but also cities and more broadly economies. And Chris, that might be a great place to start for you to just sort of talk about how the economy has been changing, how that has affected cities, and then we can kind of talk about what that means for offices.
So the modern office evolved in the 18th, 19th century as we were becoming an industrial economy. And number 1 and number 3, as far as purposes for the office, really evolved out of that industrial economy where you now have national, global organizations and you need command and control. The other thing that offices had then that is not as much of an issue today is some physical capital needs, like back in the mid 20th century, those huge computers that would fill up an entire floor, and that you had to be close to those huge computers to actually do your job. So that really ended up centralizing offices. Now, fast forward to the 1980s. When the knowledge economy layered on top of the industrial economy, and the knowledge economy uses the office in addition to those top 2, number 1 and number 3, number 2 and number 4 is much more important these days. And it's the knowledge economy that's been driving office usage. And it's important to note that back in the 1980s, that was an incredible boom period for real estate. We built more new office and absorbed more office in the 1980s than existed in 1980. That is, we built more office during that decade than we built in the country's history up until 1980. So that was the knowledge economy demanding something we didn't have enough of, office. And the reason for it was those reasons number 2 and 4. One is productivity, to increase the productivity of the knowledge workers. Innovation, creating new products, that's what the knowledge economy does. And increasing knowledge of the business. On the flip side of that is social cultural, and this is where you're building the corporate culture. And this is building up that second place in the world, the workplace, and creating this culture. So that was the reason for the office from the 1980s up until the present. Obviously, as David mentioned, we've had this enforced experiment in working from home. And the thing about productivity is that we are very pleased to see that productivity during this last 12 months has in fact held up, though it's getting a little ragged towards the end here, as we get Zoom fatigue, and we don't quite know where is the line between home and work and the hours people are spending at work while they're at home. It continues to expand. So the productivity's held up, that's great, but are we burning people out? The issue about innovation, knowledge, and corporate culture, what we found in the research is that those elements of why we have office have suffered during this pandemic. And we'll talk more about that later on, but we believe, and the research seems to show that we have been pulling out a lot of value out of existing corporate culture, out of the existing innovation, creativity, and knowledge. It's time to come back and build up that base. We liken it to an endowment. And as you probably know, with an endowment, you can spend 3-4% per year out of that endowment without eating into the capital base. Well, the last 12 months, we've been spending 10-15% of that innovation, creativity, corporate culture, capital base. And we're beginning to eat into the underlying endowment of the company. David, back to you.
Yeah, I think that's a good segue into sort of talking about some of these key drivers that we dug into in the research, and then really stress test, if you will, with some focus groups with occupiers, investors, and place managers to really understand what their experience was and what their expectations were moving forward. And as Chris said, productivity in terms of focus work, being able to have formal meetings, even doing things like this, has been strong through much of the pandemic. People are able to get their heads down and do personal work or focus work, as you might call it. There are discrepancies in that. If you are 23 and living in a studio apartment, it is less comfortable, or sharing an apartment with 4 roommates, and harder to do that than if you are 55 and have your own home office. So there's not necessarily the same experience happening, but generally, I think organizations have been surprised, or early on in the pandemic, there was a sense of surprise that the technology like Zoom and Teams and others has worked really well and connected people, and that in general, people have been able to do productive work. I would note, similar to Chris's analogy to an endowment, one of the things that came up in our focus groups was distinguishing between kind of the idea of being on offense versus being on defense. And a lot of firms indicated they felt like they were able to execute on projects that were ongoing. They were able to, not necessarily easily, but effectively support their existing clients. But moving forward, being aggressive on getting new clients, creating new products, iterating and innovating, those types of developments in productivity and the work they're doing was more challenging. And I think over time is only growing more and more challenging when people are not ever in the same room or very, very rarely in the same room. So that's some of the caveat around productivity. In terms of innovation and creativity, and the research historically has shown sort of a mixed story, which is getting outside of the office, being able to have quote unquote fresh eyes or sit in a coffee shop and be away from your normal place of business actually is a good way to, create some creative juices and again, get out of the norm. That's why, people have ideas in the shower and other random places, and sometimes having a different, environment will free those things up. But all of that research also was merging that or overlaying that with a combination of being able to do that and then be in person with your coworkers. And I think we've seen that here over the last year, that sustained innovation and creativity and that happens between teams and between people is more difficult when everyone is remote all the time and there's very little to no in-person socialization. On the company culture side, we have seen that Cushman & Wakefield, our consulting and total workplace teams measure employee experience. And we were doing that pre-COVID and obviously had to pivot the types of questions we were asking when most people were working from home, but we're able to do that and recognize that there's some real challenges. And we'll look at these in more detail in the next slide, but around connecting to the organization and ongoing learning and things that really matter in terms of being part of a culture, feeling like you're part of something that's bigger than yourself, and feeling like you understand the values and the goals of that organization. And I think there's some pent up impact from that we won't see for another 6, 12, 18 months in terms of weakened loyalty and employees not feeling the same connection with their organization, which will lead to more turnover and cause some real challenges for occupiers that they might not be feeling right now and experiencing right now because everyone is kind of in survival mode.
David, let me just jump in there and just add a little color that one of the focus group participants, one of the major consulting firms on the planet, was saying that that they've hired hundreds of new people, and they've never met them except on Zoom, and so that can't go on forever, and it's just not going to be a real way that you can work with these 25, 30-year-old young people. And David, I think you have some numbers later on that show that we baby boomers did pretty well in this downturn from a satisfaction point of view, but the Gen Zers are getting crushed because they have nobody to talk to and they have nobody to mentor them, and they can't fly their flag very high when it's all on Zoom, and they don't have those side conversations before and after meetings that we all know is where a lot of the work and a lot of the new ideas surface.
Yeah, I think that's exactly right. And one of the things we've seen is that, as I noted, like 50% of workers don't feel connected to their company, 55% don't feel like they have a sense of well-being, and about a third feel like they're not learning. And you can imagine that all of those things are actually more challenging if you're younger for a number of different reasons. One of them is just the physical space. Another key part of that is just the social and professional networks. If you've been in an industry for 15 or 20 years, you have considerably deeper and wider networks. And so it's easier to just call up on those people remotely and continue to have those relationships and continue to do your work and expand your partnerships. If you're 23, 24, 25, new to an industry, it is much harder to do that. So transitioning a little bit to what does the future look like? I think one is as I said right off the top, we have to understand that there's going to be more remote work and more agile work in the future. This new norm is, people are learning from it, and there are some real benefits from an employee experience. It's nice not to have to commute 20, 30, 40, 50 minutes every single day. It is nice to be able to execute on some focus work without having interruptions in the office. It's nice to have the flexibility in a given day to go handle, personal items or things with your kids' school, and still be able to kind of work around that and not have to worry about when you're going to be in or outside the office. So those positives really point to the fact that having choice is a net positive for employees. Working remotely all the time is not. And on the chart on the left here, you can see that really laid out, which is, this is Gallup data collected before the pandemic. So this is just under a quote unquote normal environment. Depending on how much people were working outside the office, what was their engagement level? And you can see that people who were working out of the office none of the time, so they were in 5 days a week, had low engagement relative to people in the middle there. But also once you got to 80% or more, engagement dropped again. So being outside the office too much or not really having the opportunity to work outside the office, both of those things have a negative drag on employee engagement. Somewhere in the middle is, what the future looks like. And that's verified by a lot of other surveys being done by different consulting firms and industry, organizations, which say that most people want the ability to work remotely 1, 2, 3 days a week and be in the office the other parts of the week. And so we are going to be moving to more of a hybrid model where organizations are thinking through, people are in the office some of the time, they're not other times. How do we mix that all together? I think what's interesting on this chart on the right is just the red box and how it hasn't changed. So when CoreNet Global members were asked about, pre-COVID, how many of you were really focused on a remote first kind of workplace strategy? It was about 1 in 10. And then in the middle of COVID, thinking about what it might be like afterwards, it was still 1 in 10. So people are not running to the doors to have a 100% remote workforce. We will see companies try that out, but they will be the outliers. And I think we'll also see in 2025 that companies that require office workers and knowledge base and creative class workers to be in the office 100% of the time will also be the outliers. And the norm will be this hybrid model.
And by the way, in 2018, the census did a survey of employees and in particular office employees, and 22% of us worked at home at least 1 day per week in 2018. So we expect that to go up. And that's what this chart reflects. But we don't expect it to go up to, 80%, 70% working from home. It's going to be somewhere in between 22 and probably 40% end up working from home any given day of the week.
Yeah. Yeah. And there were a number of kind of comments to that effect from the focus groups just around how they're preparing, again, not for 100% virtual or people being out even 4 days a week, but thinking about the office as part of this ecosystem and what gets done in the office. How does that fulfill the needs that workers have that they can't fulfill working from home or working in a third place, which may impact, long-term kind of layout changes and how the office is really thought about. So one of the things that was interesting as we dove into this, and Chris's colleague, Michael in particular, spent a lot of time kind of thinking through a specific case study with an actual client around when they return to the office, how much flexibility should they give? What should be sort of the HR policy? And then what's the impact on people's experience? And what does that mean from a real estate perspective? And really all these two charts in two different ways are showing is that if you move to allowing people to work remotely 1-2 days a week, very quickly, you start to degrade the amount of interaction that people have unless you are really managing this and communicating it. And so on the left here, it's kind of thinking about if you have two individuals who work together, and now they can work 2 days a week remotely, that 2.0. If there's no coordination around that, there's no communication around that, essentially by chance, they'll run into each other in the office 29% of the time, which I think is less than 6 times a month. If you get to 3, you're doing it less than 3 times a month. So very quickly, you start not seeing people very frequently.
So one of the things that we found out is, or that it obviously led from this, is that we now need to manage office space usage much better. Mm-hmm. And so it's the difference between a huge restaurant that you just walk in, there's always a table, and you're always going to be fed. as opposed to a restaurant where you have to make a reservation, be there, 10 minutes before 7, 10 minutes after 7. Otherwise, your table gets given to somebody else. We're going to have to manage our offices as we increase the hybrid nature of work. So what came out of the focus groups was fascinating because, as you probably know, corporate real estate executives almost always report up through the CFO's office, and they're focused on numbers and focused on financial performance. But they during the focus groups, they said more and more we're reporting to HR, that this is about workforce satisfaction, not just CFO, dry numbers. So interesting change in how we're going to have to manage our offices in the future.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, one final point around that from the CFO perspective is just, if you don't manage this and people just start working remotely Monday and Fridays, which is the most common way that people think about it, you haven't changed your real estate needs at all. You're just underutilizing it on those 2 days and at maximum capacity in the middle of the week. So yeah, that partnership between HR and the CFO and technology is going to be so important moving forward. So won't go into all the detail around the analysis of this, but this was some helpful simulations that were done as part of this research to understand historically what impact remote work has had on absorption. And kind of the headline is that it has had some impact, but it is not a detrimental impact, that if remote work were to double, which is likely that, pre-pandemic, about 5% were working remotely every single day, according to the BLS. That might end up being 10% when we get on the other side of this. Certainly the agile work that Chris referenced earlier, people who are working from remotely some part of the time, that's probably going to grow post-pandemic as well. But what we've seen historically over the last 15 years is across the US, and we looked at 35 of the largest US markets, that there was essentially a negative impact of about 25 basis points of absorption based on the total office stock in a given market. And you can see, there's somewhat of a linear relationship. The more remote work grew, which is what the x-axis is, the more there was some drag on absorption moving forward. But it does vary market to market. Each of those red dots essentially reflects one of those 35 markets across the United States. As we've looked forward, and our Cushman & Wakefield forecast team has kind of thought about this and really analyzed a lot of things, the expectation that is here in the US that there'll be, a continued drag of about 15 to 18%. So that's 15 or 18% of absorption we might have expected to happen will not happen because of growth in work from home. So again, an impact, not an, completely insignificant impact, but not totally devastating to the market as a whole. And if we put it in the context of our expectations around office using job growth over the next decade, it's 5 to 7x higher, meaning we're going to create jobs that are going to increase absorption by 5 to 7 times as much as we're going to lose from any agile workforce. So by the middle of this decade, we expect to be getting about 80 to 100 million square feet of new absorption in North America, just from new office using jobs, while we'll see, 12, 15 million square feet of loss from the agile workforce and the growth in remote work.
One of the things that we sort of came to the conclusion, since net absorption bounces around so much annually in any market, that when you look back on this episode that we've been through, say from a 2025 perspective, I would suggest that we're going to have a hard time sussing out what was the quantification of the impact of this hybrid, just because it's probably, just as David just said, probably 20-25% of the total absorption over the next few years will be impacted by it. But it's going to be hard to find that out, because that's a relatively small portion of it. So there will be an impact, no question. But basically, we will be coming back. the question is in what form, and we're suggesting that it's going to be more hybrid. One of the things that we have found, and Jim, who is with Travelers, may have a big insight on this. We talked to a number of office investors who have office investments in China, Japan, and Taiwan, and they have of course controlled the pandemic far better than we have here, or for that matter, Western Europe. And their reaction is, hey, the new future, the new normal is the old normal, that they're back. And that as far as a comparable, that if you believe that you can look at Tokyo and Taipei and say that that's a comparable to St. Paul, those downtowns are pretty much back to what they were in 2019.
Yeah, absolutely. So one of the kind of last points on this is that these things do vary. So, Chris has just talked a little bit about some of the geographical impacts we've seen. We see in our data that there are differences in how different types of workers experience this and what their expectations are moving forward for how much of their time will be agile or some sort of hybrid inside the office, outside the office. That can vary by department or team. It definitely varies by types of tasks. And so the workplace, the office, is becoming more and more task-based and driven by what works most effectively there versus remotely versus some sort of hybrid. And that, like many of the trends, both with real estate and elsewhere, within coming out of COVID, these are trends that were happening and they just got accelerated by this shock, if you will. It's the same thing we're seeing with e-commerce or delivery of food. So this idea that the office should be, task oriented in terms of, focusing on what needs to be done there is something that organizations have been moving towards and moving away from, desks and personal space, because as one of our focus group members mentioned, you can respond to email anywhere. You can do that at home. You can do that on the train. That's not the purpose of the office. The office exists to really offer things that can't be done elsewhere. I think that's an important thing to keep in mind from the placemaker perspective as well, which is the environment, the neighborhood should be, offering an environments that you can't get from home. And that's what downtowns, whether they're small or large, have to offer, which is you can bring a lot of people together. You can have the amenities. Obviously, in a lot of markets right now, the retail amenities, the theater, those sorts of things are not as open as they will be, hopefully here in 6 to 12 months. But that experience and that environment and the fact that we are social creatures is going to matter and be a draw to get people back into the office, even if it's 3 days a week.
David, let me jump in there, because the place managers, such as the downtown St. Paul bid, is crucial to make this recovery happen, because the retail, of course, has been affected probably every bit as badly as, say, hotels. Those are the two major categories that have been absolutely crushed as far as revenue generation. The office space, obviously, people aren't showing up for office over the last 12 years, but we've got 5, 10, 20-year leases. So the owners of those various office spaces, that assuming that they have credit tenants, they're still seeing their revenues somewhat hold up. But it's the retail that really adds the joy, adds the excitement, and makes the sidewalks interesting and safe to get around. Over the last 12 months, we had a place management focus group, and they were just saying, my Lord, many of our sidewalks have just been taken over by the homeless, been taken over by criminals, and not particularly inviting. So it's kind of a 1980s revisited kind of situation. So clean and safe functions become really important. Economic development functions, as far as bringing back the retail, becomes important. And I hope that the office owners work with their retail tenants that are already in place, rather than, chucking them out and thinking that they're going to get another retailer in very quickly. So the place management function is really important now, more than any time since the 1980s, to have that clean, safe, and vital walkable urbanism. That is why our downtowns have been working so well over the last 20, 25 years.
Mhm. So the other point to make on this particular slide is just around something that Chris touched on early on, which is that this experience varies by geography or generation, excuse me. And we've kind of touched on this a couple of different times, but younger workers have struggled more working remotely. And some of that is pandemic specific, in that you can't go out and work at a co-working site very easily. Many older millennials and younger Gen Xers have been dealing with childcare duties and virtual schooling and those sorts of things in many markets. And so that makes the balance between work and life very difficult. But some of these things are more structural, in that younger workers want to be around older workers. They want to be mentored. They want the opportunity to learn and to raise their hand very easily to jump into projects. And there's a real career development issue when people are remote, especially when everyone's remote. And so, providing those opportunities and bringing people back is going to be a real boon for young workers. I heard of one example over in New Zealand, I believe, where they had the COVID pandemic kind of under control. One of these clients opened their office and no one was coming back, and they actually mandated their senior and mid-level leaders had to come back essentially every single day for a little while. And once they did that, a lot of their younger workers were back, and their more junior employees got back very quickly because they wanted to be seen and they wanted to be there. But if the sort of status was, or the communication was essentially, well, no one's needs to come in, or the leaders don't think it's important, it wasn't really happening. So occupiers are gonna have to think through what that looks like if they want their people back most of the time or all the time. How are they going to structure the kind of the HR and the change management and the communication around getting people excited to be back, whether that's through who's leading the way, whether that's through what they're offering people when they do come back and amenities. And there's an article, I think just today or yesterday, in the Wall Street Journal about that, with both landlords and occupiers, making it as attractive as possible through amenities and other services that might not have been available a year ago.
So as I mentioned, I'm a baby boomer, and there's a lot that we baby boomers should be apologizing for. And once again, this has not affected us as badly as the younger generation. So once again, we apologize to you. But I think it's incumbent, just as David said, that the older workers make a commitment to come back, because they've got to be in that mentor position and pass the baton on to the next generation. So I hope that we won't screw up like we've done so many other things and be missing in action.
Yeah. So just kind of a few final thoughts, and I don't know, Joe, if we're going to go to Q&A, we'd be glad to do that. But again, we've seen that through this pandemic, some things have worked really well, but the office has a really critical role in making people as productive as possible. Certainly the innovation and creativity piece, connecting people, connecting ideas, going back to those four, purposes of the office. Those bottom two really are about bringing people together and then bringing ideas together. And this idea that knowledge spillovers and connection are so important inside an organization, but then also across other organizations when you're in multi-tenanted environments and in urban, or urban-esque suburbs where there's a lot of people right next to each other. There's a lot of benefits to that. And as I alluded to before, I think there's some real challenges from the employee retention that we haven't seen yet, because there's been a pullback or a break in corporate culture and connection for a lot of employees that will have to be rebuilt in person in a lot of ways as we move past the pandemic. Any other closing thoughts, Chris, from focus groups?
Yeah, just one more thing, which is just a comparison to the last pandemic that that we suffered, which of course was 100 years ago in 1919 into 1920, which was a much worse pandemic. I mean, 50 million plus people around the world died. So here in this country, we had 500,000 people die, probably going to 600 by the time we get it under control. And probably we had 2 or 3 million die of a much smaller population. So it was a much worse situation. And what did we get after that? You know, both the First World War and this terrible pandemic, we got the Roaring 20s. So as my wife has pointed out, that there is pent-up joy out there. And I think we see it in all the economic statistics that this economy is just about ready to explode in a good way. And so we both expect the office market to come back. Obviously, again, there's a bump there's been a bump in the road, but it is not going to crater the office industry.
Thank you so much, Chris and David. I'm sort of your final words were kind of ringing in my ears. This is not going to crater the office economy, and that obviously is a critical part of downtowns. I have a question for you. You know, Brookings has done some interesting research about job growth, and the knowledge economy has been concentrated over the last 15 or so years in cities, and especially in sort of the super cities of New York, Boston, Seattle, and Austin. What do you think this disruption means? I mean, I think I heard you say that in many ways this disruption has been an acceleration. You know, the whole game board didn't get tossed up and sort of thrown out, but it's been an acceleration of existing trends. What do you think will be the sort of fates of the super cities and smaller cities like St. Paul, and then urbanization within our regions? And I guess pragmatically, what should we be doing to make sure that maybe we come out of this disruption as winners rather than losers?
David, let me take a shot at this. I've been a senior fellow at Brookings, and much of the work out of Brookings on this very topic is stuff that I participated in. Mark Murrow is the senior fellow who is carrying on that work. And so I think there is a very real strategy that a St. Paul can follow that'll benefit it, due to the fact that those superstar cities shot themselves in the foot as far as the creation of affordable housing. And I'm not talking about 80% AMI housing. I'm talking about attainable housing for everybody. And you know, the worst, of course, has been San Francisco. You may or may not know this, but during the last 10 years, for every one house that was built in the Bay Area, they added 10 jobs. I mean, that's ridiculous. That the NIMBY opposition was so fierce. And the same thing in New York. There was just not enough housing production. We are short in this country, mainly in those superstar cities, 7 to 12 million housing units. And almost all of them want to be higher density, walkable urban. So the two winners, in my mind, coming out of this downturn will be both the urbanizing suburbs, particularly of New York and Boston and Washington and San Francisco and Seattle. The urbanizing suburbs should be getting anywhere from 40, 50, maybe even 60% of net absorption growth in the office market and in residential. But the second winners will be the second tier cities. We've certainly seen that with Nashville and of course Austin, where you can buy, you know, for $500,000, you can buy some of the largest housing available and the most luxurious housing available in those markets. 500,000 doesn't get you in the front door in New York or San Francisco. So they have their, you know, they really have their just themselves to blame for not providing enough housing for their workforce. And you in St. Paul can take advantage of that.
Thank you. I want to invite, we do have some extra time here for some questions. So I want to invite, if you have a question, go ahead and throw it in the chat. Emma, I'll ask you to help me maybe call on folks as you see those come in. And I want to start, Pat Wolf, if you wouldn't mind taking yourself off mute. You had a good question, and I'd love for our guests and our audience to hear it.
Thanks, Joe, and thanks for putting together this great panel, and thanks to David and Chris. Here's my question. St. Paul is the capital of the state of Minnesota, and we're also the county seat. As a result, we have a lot of governmental agencies and units here, and there's a nice mixture of government-owned buildings as well as those units that are occupied in leased buildings, privately owned. A big concern of some of the landlords is that with the work from home model, what's going to happen, particularly given the fact that the state has a 30-day out clause that can be exercised in some of these leases. Are you seeing the same kind of results in the public sector as you are seeing in the private sector? And could you speak to that question? Thanks.
With the focus groups, we really heard loud and clear that they didn't know what the hell was going to happen when we got back, as far as, you know, both their configuration of the office space and whether they were going to downsize or not. They were waiting to see, and I'm guessing that the public sector is in the same situation. And of course, public sector being a state capital, and of course, I live here in Washington, D.C., that it's a good news, bad news story. The good news, of course, is that during a downturn, that government continues to work, generally speaking, and that the private sector is where much of the pain and employment loss is suffered during a downturn. So that gives you a baseline upon which you can build your economy. The bad news is that government does not tend to boom in good times, and government as a participant in your walkable urban downtown, it's pretty miserable. Government, you know, civic functions, civic centers tend to, you know, roll up the sidewalks at 4 p.m. and you know 5 days a week, and they're completely dead at night, and of course dead on the weekends. So they don't add to the vitality that makes downtown St. Paul. So that's the bad news. But David, have you heard anything else from either the government sector or the private sector over the last 2 months as far as plans?
No, I haven't. I know, you know, in certain parts of the federal government, they were ahead of the private sector in terms of offering remote work as a cost-saving measure. So that may reduce some of the post-pandemic impacts, but I haven't heard of any major shift moving forward, you know, in the public sector that would, you know, cause a big change in how they're using space. But
I have an insight, and I'd love, Chris, maybe you know of research or perhaps have colleagues that could look into this, but I've had a theory that often that trend among public sector employees has to do with the extent to which our public sector has been so heavily loaded with baby boomers amongst their workforce, and that's sort of obviously going to go through a necessary shift. I'll be eager. My hope, in fact, is that as that shift occurs and younger workers get loaded into the workforce, that they'll in fact behave more like the sort of general population of office workers.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more that we need to get rid of these baby boomers. I mean, get out the door, please.
I really didn't mean to say it that way.
No, but I agree. And you know, one of the reasons that they're hanging around so long is they did such a lousy job planning for their retirement. So they're, you know, they don't want to be a greeter at Walmart. So they stay with their government job. But they will obviously go, and they will be replaced by, you know, Gen X workers, and that should help promote a more vital, walkable urban place in downtown St. Paul.
Matt had a question. Matt, go ahead, take yourself off mute and ask your question.
Am I there? Thanks, Joe. I saw the slide that compared millennials, Gen Xers, and baby boomers in terms of their comfort level, or their ability to work from home. What my question is whether you have insights as to the preference of those groups to work from home. Do you have any data on their desire to work from home among those three groups?
Yeah, I mean, I think the desire for flexibility is very high and among young workers. And you think sort of just culturally, at least pre-pandemic, baby boomers were less likely to sort of see that as an option or something they wanted. And Gen Xers to a certain degree as well. And really millennials have been pushing a lot of this flexibility in the office and being able to work different places. And now you have Gen Z coming in. So we have seen that younger workers want more flexibility, but not necessarily, 100% remote work.
Thank you.
Yeah, the really interesting thing that we've all experienced, Matt, over the last 12 months is that we've gotten to know our coworkers so much better, and we've gotten to know their kids. We've gotten to know their class of 2020 puppies. But we also have gotten to know how they live. And the weirdest one I had was a Zoom with a bunch of young people, and it was in the fellow's bedroom, which is always weird to have be peering into somebody's bedroom. And then over the guy's shoulder, about 15 minutes in, the bed started moving and his roommate woke up and walked out. I mean, this is not a way to conduct business. Come on, guys.
I love it. Thank you.
We've lucky to have a couple of elected officials that represent downtown that have joined us today. Senator Sandy Pappas has been on, and as well as our council member representing downtown, Councilmember Rebecca Naker. And Councilmember has a question for us. So go ahead, Councilmember.
Yeah, thanks so much. This has been a really interesting presentation. And I'm wondering a little bit, you talked about the importance of supporting downtown retail, which I couldn't agree more about. Talk a little bit more about what we can do to support retail. I have to imagine there's going to be a dramatic impact from this decrease in foot traffic day to day. It's already a challenge in many downtowns to keep retail going, especially after office hours. And so I'm just wondering, is there anything that government or downtown improvement districts can do to compensate for that inevitable decline in traffic?
Well, what I've seen, for instance, in Grand Rapids is the city working with property owners as far as when property taxes are being paid, postponing that, not forgiving, but postponing it. The downtown business improvement districts have been urging what I mentioned earlier, working with office owners to help negotiate funding for the retailers from the various federal programs. So the BIDs know how to access the funding coming out of Washington, and obviously we're going to get, we hope, another big slug of it. That should be the last. And the bids have been a major portal to get that money to maintain the workforce and be able to pay the rent. But the third area that, again, I mentioned earlier is that the bids are perfectly positioned to work with the retailers and with the property owners to make sure they understand, hey, we're all in this together. You're not going to do yourself any good as an office owner throwing out the retail. We know, the research, we did some research at George Washington University looking at the impact on rent of having a coffee shop in your building in a walkable urban place. And it's like a 5 to 7% increase in the office rents if you've got a coffee shop in your building. So this is going to help you. And we know what Whole Foods and Trader Joe's do to animate the street life and increase rents. So it's incumbent upon the office owners to recognize we're going to get through this, and it's better to get through it with people who have a commitment and an investment, including tenant investment dollars, or a tenant improvement dollars, than just going to try to find somebody else. And then finally, of course, the BIDs have a critical role to play in the safety of downtown, and particularly making sure that the BID and the local police are working together and not viewing each other as somehow competitive with one another.
Yeah, the one other thing I would add, which is maybe longer term, obviously, Chris and I got an opportunity to speak to the St. Pete sort of version of their downtown association, and they were, informing us around the difference between St. Pete and Tampa, and how there's just more residential and more, they've developed more apartments in St. Pete, and that they've really seen a lot more activity in their area through even COVID. And obviously, Florida and its, government response to COVID has been different than other parts of the country, some parts of the country at least. But that having that, the people who live in and right around BIDs obviously turns it from, a 12-hour a day to a 16 or 24-hour a day type environment, which is so important for a lot of those retailers.
Yeah, let me just build on that, because certainly, historically, even 100 years ago, downtowns did not have residential. It was office and retail and a hotel only. So bringing residential into the downtown is a recent phenomenon over the last 20, 30 years. And so increasing, all the incentives to bring more residential downtown is really important to not just turn it into a 18-hour place, but also to build up the retail viability, which will then make it more exciting for the office user to come. It is a complete ecosystem. So, downtown DC is 80% office. 20 years ago, it was 95% office. But the real push right now is more and more residential downtown. And so another thing is the consideration of an incentive program and tax abatement possibly for the conversion of office building, particularly Class B and Class C office space, into residential. And this particularly works with older office space because the floor plates are 10,000 square feet, perfect for residential, too small for office, at least modern office. So they convert beautifully to residential. And so finding ways to get Class B and Class C office space to convert to residential makes a whole lot of sense.
Well, we're at time, and first of all, I want to thank David and Chris for joining us. This has been a great session, and I'm really, really grateful for your time and for your expertise. I for one, obviously I'm biased. I love urban spaces. I love downtowns. I especially love downtown St. Paul, and I have every confidence that when it's safe for us to come back and get into an elevator without concern, that we're all going to be just so thrilled to come back and to go to hockey games and to go back to the theater and go back and see hip hop shows and rock concerts. It's the spring baseball is around the corner. Once it's safe, I absolutely believe that downtown St. Paul is indeed a special place, and it's special in part because of all of you that love it and invest in it. So thank you for joining us today. Again, thanks to our speakers. Thanks to all of you. Thanks to our leaders, our business leaders, our workers, our residents, and our visitors. We love you all. We can't wait to have you back. Thanks a lot.